patience, and thanks to all of the folks leading these organizational parts of our club. They're so important. We can't do it without you. Anne is going to introduce our speaker today, and we really are grateful for Anne's leadership and organizing an amazing slate of programs this year. So, Anne Carper.
Thank you. Right, and the meeting is being recorded. Before we begin, I'd just like to introduce our new Zoom technician, Amelia, who's going to be handling all our Zoom activities, so we'll have a nice smooth run. I did wake up with that sick feeling in my stomach this morning because I knew that everything would be handled by very capably by Mel. So thank you very much. Yeah, Monday. So welcome to everyone here and to the 20 or so of those of you on Zoom. I'm very happy to introduce Ethan Tapper. He served as a Chittenden County Forester for the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks and Recreation since 2016. In that role, he advises private landowners, municipalities, conservation organizations, foresters, and loggers on the responsible stewardship of Vermont forests, 80% of which are privately owned, which I didn't know. Ethan grew up in Vermont and earned a degree in forestry from UVM, and I hope he has time to just share a bit of how he got into forestry. He relayed that very entertainingly on a YouTube video that I watched over the weekend, so I hope you can work that in. Ethan, as part of his communication and forestry responsibilities, writes a column for 10 community newspapers and for Northern Woodlands magazine. He maintains a YouTube channel and leads public events throughout New England. Last year, he was honored as Regional Forester of the Year by an alliance of state foresters from the Northeast and the Midwest, so that's a nice honor. Finally, his book, How to Love a Forest, will be published by Broadleaf Books next fall, so we'll have to be on the lookout for that. Afterwards, Ethan said he would answer a few questions, so we'll just take them from the room first, and then the people on Zoom, if you have any, please enter them in the chat. And Jake's, I'm sorry.
We're just talking about
Yeah, we're just talking about Jake Tapper versus Ethan Tapper. So, Ethan's recording will be available on our website afterwards for those of you who'd like to hear it again or unable to meet. So please welcome Ethan Tapper.
Hello. Can you see me on that thing? Cool.
Yeah.
So my name is Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester for the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks and Recreation. Like Ann said, that kind of means a lot of different things. So just to give you a quick rundown on what that means, it's basically 4 things. The first thing is that I administer this program called the Current Use Program in Vermont. The Use Value Appraisal Program is its official name. It's a tax abatement program for landowners who own more than 25 acres of forested land. They agree not to subdivide or develop their land, and in exchange, they get a tax break. And they also have to follow a forest management plan, which is approved by the county forester, monitored by the county forester. The second thing I do is provide service. So that just means if you have forested land in Vermont, you have a county forester, and you can call them up and we'll advise you on how to take care of it. Maybe come and take a walk with you and let you know what's going on in your woods and how to do right by it. The third thing is I manage municipal forests, town forests. So I manage about a dozen forests, about 4,500, 5,000 acres, and I manage them for demonstration and education and a lot of other things. And then the fourth thing is just sort of answering this question of how do we improve the health of forests and the quality of forest management in the county that we have, with the people that we have and the forests that we have. And so I'm from Chittenden County, actually from Windham County, down near Bellows Falls in a little town called Saxton's River, Vermont. But I live in Chittenden County now. And so the answers to those questions in Chittenden County might be different than they are in some of our more rural counties like Essex or Caledonia or Orleans County up in the northeast part of the state. But that's the really fun thing about this work that we do. And so, like Ann said, I write columns. I have a monthly column and a quarterly column in this magazine, Northern Woodlands. YouTube channel. I do a lot of public events like this. I think this is about my 40th this year. And I do a lot of other stuff. So right now I have a forest management project that's ongoing at the Catamount Community Forest in Williston, which has been part of this like 3-year education and outreach process to showcase what responsible forest management looks like. And we're actually managing, in that case, at the Catamount Community Forest, and you can stay tuned to this by watching my YouTube channel, which is just under Chittenden County Forester, if you search for it on YouTube. the way that we're taking a relatively young forest, like most of Vermont's forests are, and actually managing it actively to manifest the attributes and these amazing qualities that old growth forests have that might take centuries to develop on their own, but that we can develop using management in just decades. Anyway, so old growth forests or old forests, what are they? Why do we care? And how do we maybe take care of them or manage them on our modern landscape? So why are we here? We're here because forests are important to us. So in Vermont, as Ann mentioned, you know, we're 75% forested, 80% of those lands are owned by private landowners, which is actually pretty incredible. You know, so we have all these public benefits that come from forests. We know what they are, right? Clean air, clean water, wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration and storage. They regulate our climate. They make our world beautiful. You know, in Vermont, the green on the Green Mountains are forests. They're this incredibly important part of where we live, aesthetically, culturally, economically, and in all kinds of other ways, ecologically, climatically. I think most people have a sense that old growth forests are important or that we should like them, but we don't really necessarily even know why that's the case, beyond the fact that, or even what they're like, right? Maybe they have some big trees, but other than that, what do we really know about what they are? So the purpose of this presentation is take a close look at these old growth forests, just talk about how amazing they are and what they're actually like. And then also think about what our role is and, you know, what all these things mean for us as forest stewards and forest advocates. So there is even some discrepancies among foresters, ecologists, biologists as to what an old growth forest means, what that term actually means when we're talking about old growth forests. So a lot of people, the actual scientists, will often say that old growth forests are primary forests. So old growth forests are forests that have never been extensively disturbed by humans, right? So with this definition, there's a finite amount of them. You can't make any more. They're just the ones that happen to have not been logged or cleared. There's an alternate variation of this definition, which is forests that have not been extensively disturbed by European descended humans, because we know that indigenous peoples in a lot of parts of the Northeast and across the country were actually had a very big role in the forests that we have. So you could have forests that are old growth and that were burned or otherwise managed by indigenous peoples, but never by European descended peoples, who we tend to have a little bit of a different style of management. A second definition would be forests that are old. So saying that a forest becomes an old growth forest after some amount of time, let's say 150 years, 200 years, 300 years. And if a forest hasn't seen extensive disturbance in that amount of time, it's an old growth forest, whatever it is, right? You take a forest, you leave it for a certain amount of time, then it's an old growth forest. Might also call these primeval or ancient forests. It really is variable by the type of forest, how long that period of time might be. Some people would say a good estimate is 150 years, but there are also old growth forests, or there are also forests that are older than 150 years old, but are not what we might call old growth forests for a variety of reasons. This last term is a term that probably you all are not as familiar with. It's called late successional forests. So forests, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, forests go through this process of development that we call succession. It's called succession because it's a series of stages, each of which follows or succeeds the last, right? So there's this orderly process. As forests move through time, they change. The earlier stages of that, when a forest maybe is just regenerating from being an old pasture, or maybe from being a clear cut, or from a large scale natural disturbance, we would call early succession, just in those few years after that big disturbance occurred. Later in their course of development or succession, we would call them late successional. Late successional forests have this array of different attributes, which is often what we think about when we think about old growth forests. They have old trees, but not a lot. They have lots of different sizes and ages of trees. They have dead wood on the ground everywhere, and a bunch of other really interesting things. So we might, when you hear people talk about an old growth forest, they might be talking about any of these things. They might be talking about a primary forest, a forest that has never been extensively disturbed, an old forest, a forest that hasn't been extensively disturbed in a long time, or a late successional forest, a forest that just has all of these attributes that are often associated with old growth. In almost every presentation that I do, I put this slide up and I ask the question of what's a forest, because that's sort of an even more basic question, right? Like, we all know what it is. We know it when we see it. It's a place with a bunch of trees in it or something, right? And it's one of these things where it's like, to a lay person, that's enough. You know when you've entered a forest. When you think about forests all the time, it just gets really complicated. And you're like, actually, what is it though? Like, what is the difference between, say, a forest and like a park that has a bunch of trees? This is a picture from Shelburne Farms. Any of y'all been to Shelburne Farms? And I put this up there because this is the version of a forest that most of us would like to see, right? It's like these evenly spaced trees and there's nothing growing in the understory. And that is, like, in my view, a pretty depauperate and sterile forest. It's something wrong with it. This is a better definition of what a forest is, right? So we tend to be really tree focused when we think about forests. Better to think about it as a community, what we call a natural community. And this is a definition that's from the book Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, which is sort of like our textbook on natural communities in Vermont. It was written, there's a new edition. The original edition was written by Liz Thompson, Eric Sorensen. Bob Zano is an author in this newest edition. They define a natural community as an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. So it's like this process of reimagining forests, not just as these trees, but as this entire community of living things, right? So I think of a forest as the trees in a forest, like the coral in a coral reef. So if we were thinking about a coral reef, none of us would just think about the coral itself, right? We would think about this entire web of life that's woven around that living structure. And that's the way that forests are too. And so if we allow ourselves to reimagine forests in this way, you can actually see that community, that thing that is sort of this reimagined forest, cannot function without all those pieces and parts, without the trees and also the plants and the fungi and the bacteria and the invertebrates and the reptiles and the amphibians and the mammals and the birds and everything. And also that you're not managing that system well unless you're managing it to do right by that entire community. That's what we're trying to do as we manage forests, is not just to manage these trees independent of that community, but to call that entire community and even the processes that affect it, the natural disturbances, things like that, as part of the forest. So this community, it's not static. Forests are incredibly dynamic. They're changing all the time. And those changes are a part of the forest. Now, one of the really weird things, I'll talk about the history a little bit more. We don't have a lot of examples of what an old or undisturbed forest actually looks like. They're exceedingly rare in our landscape. We have had to sort of reconstruct what these historical forests might have looked like from old survey records and historical accounts and pieces and parts from all different kinds of places. We know that prior to European colonization, which started in this region really in the late 1700s, southern New England, 1600s, but really the early 1800s is when we start to see like the really, really extensive impact on our landscape in Vermont and New Hampshire, especially in Vermont. 100% of our forests were primary, obviously, right? They'd never been extensively disturbed by Europeans before Europeans got here. But some people say that only somewhere between 55 and 70% were old by that definition. So they weren't necessarily what we would now recognize as old growth forests, because natural disturbances were happening all the time, knocking over areas of forests, burning them, ice storms were hitting them. All of these things were happening to them all the time. And so you might have been able to walk through a forest and seen that all the trees in this old growth forest were very young. We think we had greater than 90% forest cover. One of the really interesting stories that most people don't know about is the legacy of beavers on our landscape, which is a huge impact on our pre-colonization wildlife communities. So we think that in our valleys, we may have had as many as 300 beaver dams per square mile. So like one beaver dam per every two beaver dam, square mile is 640 acres. So 300 beaver dams on every 640 acres. Really extensive, and they would have actually been, so beavers are amazing, right? Because they're regulating hydrology and water quality and aquatic habitat. And they're also killing trees and driving these disturbance regimes, changing the way that our forests look, turning old forests into young forests, having those regrow. Beavers were, and I'll talk about this a little bit more as well, beavers are actually driven out of most parts of Vermont and New Hampshire by the late 1600s because they were, their pelts were highly valued, especially for millinery, hat making. And I believe that by the 1670s, something like 250,000 beaver pelts had been shipped to Europe from the Connecticut River Valley alone. Really, really extensive. And so it caused all these other impacts. It also caused a series of wars between indigenous peoples because they were trading these things for really amazing resources like steel and pots. And then as they were trapping all the beavers out of their trapping grounds, they would then go to war with other peoples for their trapping grounds. So it caused this incredible social and environmental upheaval and the loss of an incredible amount of habitat. We had very different wildlife populations. So we think that the large ungulates on our landscape, which now of course are moose and deer, we think that we probably didn't have any deer in most of Vermont and New Hampshire. We had moose, but we also had caribou and a now extinct species of elk called eastern elk, a forest dwelling elk. And they were hunted by wolves and catamounts, right? Both of which were extinct by the late 1800s. Didn't have any coyotes here until like the 1940s. Deer were actually reintroduced in the late 1800s. Very different tree species as well. So we think that prior to European colonization, by far the most common tree species in Vermont was beech, American beech, which at the time was a species that was capable of living 400 years and being this massive important tree species. Now it has a non-native pathogen, beech bark disease, which makes it only able to live about 40 to 60 years and behave completely differently. And in our coastal areas, not as much inland, but in some coastal areas and in areas where there are permanent indigenous settlements, more like in Vermont, New Hampshire, we saw evidence of indigenous burning as well. So you can't talk about forests without talking about the history. Isn't that amazing? So that's what they called like a sugar orchard back in the day. So you walk through these forests now, and what you see is these wolf trees, these just wide branching, ancient, often sugar maple trees that are like so much older than all the trees that are around them. Those trees were probably standing in something like this for 100 years. So what we saw in New England in the 1800s, early 1900s, really it started with Napoleon. In the early 1800s, these Napoleonic wars caused all this upheaval in Europe, and there was a special kind of sheep that was not allowed to be exported from Spain, the merino sheep, what we now know as the merino sheep. And in this chaos of Napoleon's invasions, some of those sheep were exported by a person who was the United States Consul to Portugal, William Jarvis, to his farm in Wethersfield, Vermont in 1811. That merino sheep had this kind of wool that was worth like 4 or 5 times as much as normal sheep's wool. It was just this really, really good producer, and it basically drove this gold rush. The other part of that was that sheep can pasture anywhere, right? Like cows can pasture on some kind of rocky, steep slopes, but sheep can really be on the rockiest, steepest, poorest pastures imaginable. By 1837, there were somewhere between 1 and 1.7 million merino sheep in Vermont. 80% of Vermont had been cleared by the mid-1800s with draft animals and saws over the course of a single generation, which is amazing to see. There's actually an amazing book by George Perkins Marsh, famous Vermonter, man of nature. And he talked about actually witnessing this transformation. He was born in like 1801, witnessing this transformation across the span of his life. Watching Vermont be dominated by forest and then go to being basically forest was extremely rare. During that time, all the beaver, the turkey, the fisher, moose, caribou, elk, catamount, wolves, bear, otter, Canada geese, marten, passenger pigeons, and others were driven out of the state. There was also extensive resource exploitation at the time. So I had learned, I think this is what a lot of us learn in school as Vermonters, that the pasturing was like what caused this wide scale land clearing. But there also was pretty extensive resource exploitation. By the mid 1800s, basically everybody was using wood for everything in Vermont. So trains were running on wood. They were using wood to smelt iron and to do things like, you know, for limestone kilns and stuff like this, to make bricks. This is pre-advent of the wood stove. So a normal home might burn 40 to 60 cords of wood a year. They were burning it to boil sap. And obviously they had all these pastures, so they had to make fence posts. And during the mid-late 1800s, wood became a kind of currency in Vermont because of that fence post, that need for fence posts. By the mid-1800s, trains and steamboats were still using wood. All the railroads in the US were using 7 million cords of wood annually by 1870. Railroad ties were a big source of wood. Railroads were using about 30 million ties a year just for repairs. And that's the timber from about 150,000 acres being clear cut every year just for repairs, not to build any new sections of track. Forests were often clear cut on these short rotations, like 30 years, so they'd be allowed to regrow and then they'd be cut. So obviously, this is all to say that our forests are extremely altered. Like, we have all these forests and we just assume that they're ancient and primeval and they're fine and everything is normal. And they are far from normal, which is one of the things that makes old growth forests so incredible, is because they are such a rare instance of a forest that actually hasn't been extensively exploited, that hasn't been cleared and maintained as a pasture for 200 years, for instance. I say that to most people, you can assume that every forest you've ever been in was a pasture in the 1800s and was maintained as such for a century. Pretty wild to think about. So we don't really have a lot of good templates for what old growth forests look like. The legacy of this really extensive land use on Vermont's landscape is that our forests in general, compared to just a couple hundred years ago, which is really a blink of an eye in evolutionary time, it's no time at all. Our forests are younger, right? Just having originated from these pastures, almost all of them within the last 60 to 100 years, which is not a long time for a forest. They're like babies. They're less diverse, so they don't have lots of different species of trees, what we call species diversity. They also don't have structural diversity, different sizes and ages of trees, which I mentioned is one of the characteristics of an old growth forest, or what we call late successional attributes. Our landscapes also lack diversity. So if we were to come here 300 years ago, we wouldn't see that all of our forests would look the same. We would see that our forests across our landscape were this mosaic of forests of different ages and types and expressions that were offering different kinds of habitats. Altered tree species composition, obviously, because we've lost multiple tree species to non-native pathogens, like what I mentioned with American beech, functionally lost American beech and other species like American elm. And obviously had our wildlife populations change. So beaver have been reintroduced. They were reintroduced in the 20s. Other species like turkey were reintroduced in the 60s. Fisher were reintroduced in the 60s to combat the porcupine problem. Any of you aware of the porcupine bounty in Vermont? Yeah, there was one for like 50 years. And it was because the only native predator of the porcupine is the fisher, or what we call fisher cat, right? Big weasel. That was trapped out because it's a fur bearer. It has a nice pelt like a mink. And so for a while, you could turn in a pair of porcupine ears to the town clerk, and they would issue you the bounty. And from what I'm told, there was some counterfeiting that happened, that you can make a pretty good pair of porcupine ears from a porcupine belly. I talked to these, and the porcupine are also, it's sad, but they're also pretty easy to kill. And they were just everywhere. They were just like eating people's houses at that time because they had no predator. And I talked to these sisters, were one of the first people, they're from Mudville, so Morseville, one of the first people to hike the Long Trail. And the way that they paid for their supplies was they would go to these shelters, it would be full of porcupines, and they would club a bunch of porcupines and cut their ears off, and then they would take them to the town clerk and buy food. And that's just what people used to do. Can you imagine? I think about this often with the town clerks that I know, just dropping a bag of porcupine ears on their desk. So like that picture of Shelburne Farms, this is what we want old growth forests to look like. This is what we think they look at like, right? They're a single generation of trees, evenly spaced, they're big, there's nothing growing in the understory, we can see really well. What we're learning is that this is probably, so if I should say first, if this looks like a good looking forest to you, you are absolutely not alone. This is what everybody thinks a good looking forest looks like. I have walked in the woods with hundreds and hundreds of people, and on some level, everybody wants their forest to look like that. So that's, there's a lot of different pieces and parts of that. There's actually some research, the biologist E.O. Wilson, who's a real inspiration to me, there's some research that he's collated that suggests that we actually have this evolutionary drive towards these savanna-like environments, which is where our species evolved for like 45 million years, whereas we've only been in forests for thousands of years. And that in some ways, we're like instinctively searching out our own habitat, which is at savanna. Old growth forests actually look really different. I say they look messy. So there are some, I mentioned some of these attributes as well earlier in the presentation. There are some big old trees, but not a lot, like 10 or 12 an acre in general. Many different sizes and ages of trees, right? So, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, but in these old growth forests, it's not like a bunch of trees grow up like a crop of corn and they all fall over at the same time and then they all grow again. It's much more irregular than that. So they're experiencing disturbances all the time. And then when they experience a disturbance, a few trees blow over, they naturally regenerate and fill that space with new trees. And that's happening all the time. In these forests that haven't seen extensive disturbances for hundreds and hundreds of years, you end up with all of these different sizes and ages of trees, each of which traces back to some natural disturbance, the death of a tree, a windstorm, an ice storm, a forest fire, logging, whatever. The canopy of this forest, it wouldn't look like a nicely mown like field of grass. It would be irregular, and there's big gaps in the canopy, big holes, which is where those disturbances have occurred. Diverse tree species composition, so lots of different species of trees, but usually dominated by trees that do well in the shade. So species like eastern hemlock, American beech, sugar maple, because these are the species that do better in an environment where there's just these small scale disturbances rather than lots of large scale disturbances. And they also have really deep, well-developed soils that have been developed over centuries or millennia. Another thing that you'll notice that isn't up here is that a lot of times the soils will be undulating like this, called pit and mound topography or pillow and cradle topography. What that is in Vermont, the main driver of tree mortality is windstorms. We think it's our forest fires. Like as forest fires are to western forests, windstorms are to our northeastern forests. And so over thousands or hundreds or thousands of years, as trees blow over, they pull their root system out of the ground, leaving a dip. And then that root system is up in the air, creating what we call a root ball. And then that eventually decomposes, making a mound. So that happens, repeat that a few hundred times, and eventually the whole forest is like undulating like that. So forests do this thing, and this is what allow a lot of these attributes to accrue. They do this thing that I call the miracle of regeneration. So you might be asking, like, I do a lot of forest management. We cut trees, we work with loggers and do stuff like that. And people are always like, well, what trees are you going to plant? And the answer is that we don't plant trees at all. We just create disturbances. I think of all foresters as like disturbance ecologists. We study the way that forests respond to change and natural disturbances, and we let that regeneration happen. Something that's really interesting with it, with the miracle of regeneration, this incredible ability that forests have to chase death with life, to respond to adversity with diversity, is that if you understand all of the different players, all the different tree species and the kind of environments that they grow in, it allows you to really reconstruct what has gone on in a forest in the past, right? So it's very interesting where, a species that probably we all could identify, white birch, if you have it in your forest, you have a generation of white birch. You will not have one white birch in most cases. And the reason for that is because white birch only grows completely in the open. So if you have white birch in your forest, it was massive natural disturbance or a clear cut, basically. And if you knew how old those white birch trees are, say if one fell over or you cut one down and you counted the rings, then the number of years old that it is about the number of years ago that disturbance occurred. And they will all be about the same age because they'll all be originating from that same disturbance. Similarly, if you see a species like yellow birch grows in smaller gaps and it likes to grow on dead wood. It actually looks like sometimes like they have legs. Any you ever seen a yellow birch where it looks like it has legs that's doing like a dance move? They grow on dead wood. So the little yellow birch seedling will establish on what we call a nurse log, just a rotting tree. And it'll put roots around it. And then the nurse log will rot away. And then it's just standing up with sort of a hole in the shape of that stump or that log or whatever piece of dead wood that it was growing on. Again, a lot of times, because of the conditions that yellow birch is good at growing in, they like to grow in disturbed soils. And when there's lots of dead wood, that's often logging creates those things. So if you see a bunch of 30-year-old yellow birch, 30 years ago, logging came that created not huge openings in the forest, but gaps maybe a quarter acre or less in size. And you can infer all that. There's an amazing book called Reading the Forested Landscape by Tom Wessels, which also goes into some more ways that you can sort of like check out these clues. This is sort of like we've already sort of talked about the stuff that's on this slide here, but just to reiterate, forest development, what we call succession. As forests develop, they move through these different phases of succession, developmental stages, starting with the one on the upper left, stand initiation, what we might call an early successional forest, which is a forest that's responding to a clear cut or a large scale disturbance or a pasture that's not being mowed or grazed anymore. And it's a really exciting time. So if you've seen like a large scale disturbance happen, like when we have these big windstorms that roll through here every 5 or 10 years, you see all those trees laying on the ground and it's just empty. And you're like, well, nothing's ever going to grow here. And then of course it does. And actually in those years, really the decade or two following that disturbance is this incredibly diverse time where it's not just young trees, but also shrubs, herbaceous plants, creating amazing habitat for forest birds and pollinators, and creating this habitat, early successional habitat, which in addition to old growth forests, we know to be underrepresented on our landscape. Eventually over time, those diverse young forests grow up and the trees shade out all the shrubs and all the flowering plants, and their canopies knit together. They're competing with each other very aggressively, and there actually is very little light on the forest floor. This phase can last from 30 to probably when a forest is 30 years old, 30 years removed from that disturbance, to 100 years. And almost all the forests that we're used to are in that stage, right? So they're like, maybe they're not babies, but they're like teenagers, where there's still a single generation of trees that are the trees that happen to have grown in that disturbance. And in a lot of cases, that disturbance is a pasture that was abandoned. And so then you end up with all this really weird stuff, like the only tree species that we have in our forest, or the species that are really overrepresented in our forest, are species that happen to be good at growing in old pastures. So white pine is the classic example of this. In Vermont, white pine is growing everywhere. And in not none, but in very few of the places where it's growing is actually a site where it's good for growing white pine. It just happens that white pine is really good at growing in old pastures. And every forest was an old pasture within the last 100 years. So you end up with an overrepresentation of species like white pine. That's when things get really exciting, is when we start to see those trees die. So this is, throughout the rest of this presentation, you're going to see that I'm like pretty fascinated with mortality, tree mortality, because really, if you were to talk to, we all want to see these trees grow and be healthy and thrive, but if you were to talk to ecologists about the health of forests, they would talk much more about mortality, the way that a forest changes, the way that the trees that comprise that forest community die. That's when things get really exciting. So over time, what you're going to see is that, for whatever reason, the trees in the overstory start succumbing to natural disturbances. They start naturally declining just at the end of their lives. And as their canopies shrink back. As they start to fall over, light hits the forest floor and the understory starts to develop again. We call this the canopy transition or the understory reinitiation period. Some of our forests are in this period as well. And then we get into where it gets really good, which is where all sense of order is lost. Trees are dying and growing. We develop these gap dynamics, which is just different gaps are established in the forest canopy as a result of natural disturbances. New species of trees grow, generations of trees of all different shapes, sizes, ages, species establish. It's just an incredibly amazing thing that happens. And that's really at that late stage, which most people would consider to be the most chaotic and uncomfortable and the least pleasant stage of forest development. Most people would really not like to walk through a forest like that if you could even walk through it at all. That's what an old growth forest is like. So this is the best book for a popular audience that I've ever read about forest ecology. Is this book called The Hidden Forest: Biography of an Ecosystem by John Luoma, not to be confused with The Hidden Life of Trees. The Hidden Forest: The Biography of an Ecosystem by John R. Luoma. John R. Luoma states, quote, "Continuing scientific investigation has proven early forest scientists, at least largely wrong, to imagine that succession would lead to a permanent, self-maintaining and stable climax, old growth, community. Ecologists have come to believe that forest ecosystems, in fact, are as much about disturbance as they are about stability." So we all want to see the trees in our forest do really well, but if you're thinking about the forest in this broader sense, you're sort of reimagining the forest as this natural community. Those disturbances, that mortality and that change is as essential to that community as the life of those trees. So at that canopy transition period, some people call that a mature forest. Doesn't really mean anything. Forest succession is a cycle. So one thing I really want to like sometimes fight against is this idea to like mythologize forests. We have all these things that we think about them and sort of expectations that we put on them. And what's really neat is instead of doing that, just to like take a step back and just be like, appreciate them as they are. That we want to, they are what they are, right? They're not what we want them to be. It's up to us to meet them there. So old growth forests are really neat, but also every stage of forest development is normal, natural, and essential. There are thousands of native species that have adapted to every stage in forest development for thousands of years. Old growth forests are really cool because they are so underrepresented on our landscape and because they have all these really cool qualities, but they're not, the only thing that matters is getting our forest to old growth. That's not true. I often say when I'm feeling a little cheeky that every old growth forest was once a young forest and it will be one again. Succession is a cycle. There are no endpoints. Change is constant. All successional stages are valuable and normal and natural. One of the things that makes old growth forests so rich is this idea of legacy and continuity, right? So legacies are just pieces and parts of previous iterations of a forest that persist into the new forest. So for instance, if you were to have a forest and there was a lot of big trees, all the big trees fall over except for one, and then a new forest grows right there around that big tree. That big tree is a legacy or a biological legacy. It's providing habitats, supporting natural processes, supporting ecological attributes in that system that are qualitatively different than those young trees. Legacies in these old forests are everywhere because it's just generation after generation of trees running into each other, mixing together, and you end up with all of this richness of continuity, that there's no beginning and no end, it just all bleeds together. So legacies are the pieces and parts of older generations of a previous forest that persists following a disturbance event. Continuity is the idea that forest development is continuous across generations of trees and disturbance events. So it never changes, or it always changes and never stops changing. We also think about these ideas of diversity and complexity. It's important as we think about mythologizing old growth forests, valuing old growth forests as they are. Old growth forests are important, not just because they're old. right? All of us love this idea of this primeval forest untouched by human hands, and that's so neat. But from an ecological perspective, they're valuable not just because they're old, but because of these attributes that they have. As forests develop, they become diverse, different sizes and ages of trees, different species of trees, and they become complex, which is all of those different biological legacies, all those different types of diversity layered atop one another. They develop these amazing properties, we call them emergent properties. These are the properties that emerge from any complex system that make them greater than the sum of their parts. So these are things that just happen. And you don't realize that they're happening until you see a forest develop naturally and the way that all these types of diversity and complexity combine. So here's a few case studies. It's 2:01. I'm gonna go 15 more.
Yeah, that's good.
Is that okay? Okay. I'm gonna rip through a few case studies. So here's an example of a place called Cambridge Pines. It's in Cambridge, Vermont, it's not in Chittenden County, but it's near where I live. This is a parcel that was cleared in the 1850s and has been allowed to revert to forest around, it was cleared in the early 1800s, allowed to revert to forest around 1850, has not been managed since, right? So it's 170 years old. So if we were thinking about the definition of old growth is a forest that's old, it's over 150 years old, maybe this is an old growth forest. Interestingly, from an ecological perspective, it's not. So it has all of these big trees. It is a single generation of giant 150-foot tall, huge white pine trees that grew in an old pasture. And it's just a very old version of that. And so now, a lot of people are like, this is an old growth forest. And when they walk in there, it's the old growth forest that people want an old growth forest to be like. Because it is those single generation of trees, evenly spaced, nothing growing in the understory. But if you go out there with ecologists, you say, wow, I can't wait for these trees to start to die. Because that is when we're going to start to get all of these really interesting ecological attributes that we really need on our landscape. That structural diversity, that dead wood on the forest floor, which is this incredibly rich attribute. One of the mind-blowing facts about dead wood that I often tell is that a dead tree can have as much as 4 times the living biomass of a living tree. It's this incredibly rich environment for a community of organisms that we call the necrosphere. So it's like the organisms whose habitat is found in tree mortality, who are completely normal and natural, fungi, bacteria, invertebrates, bugs, stuff like that, salamanders, and who are also essential to helping those trees break down and turn into soil. So these are some other pictures from Cambridge Pines. The ones on the left are seeing that mortality start to happen, seeing the canopy of this giant pine tree start to shrink, and that understory underneath is going to start to develop. Here's another cool term for you that is not going to help me speed this presentation along, but is cool, which is that trees, as they start to decline and die, they go through this period of life that we call the perimortem period, the period that precedes death. So it's this period when a tree is like sort of alive and sort of dead. It has all the habitats of a living tree and a dead tree at the same time. That's a period that can last for centuries. It's a very, very rich time that, if you were thinking about trees only in terms of timber or their value, we wouldn't think of that as a valuable time at all. But ecologically, it's incredibly rich. There's a saying from England with these English oaks that they grow for 300 years, and then they rest for 300 years, and then for 300 years, they gracefully decline. A lot of trees do that. It's very neat to watch. Another example, case study of an old growth forest, the Pisgah Forest in southwestern New Hampshire, kind of near here. Documented old growth forest that entirely blew over when the 38 hurricane came through. So it's an old growth forest without old trees. Very interesting. So it satisfies the definition of a primary forest, never been, untouched by human hands, but not an old forest. All the trees are young, or relatively young, now they're 80 years old. And not a late successional forest, doesn't have any of those attributes that structural diversity that they have. One major difference is that they do have stuff like dead wood on the ground because no one went and picked those trees up. So even though it's a young forest, it's what we might call a complex young forest because it's a young forest plus still having those soils, still having the deadwood on the ground, which a lot of the young forests across our landscape that were generated from these old pastures don't have. The last case study that I'm going to give, this is a weird one. My friend Liz Thompson told me about this one. This is a really cool book called The Last Stand. It's about these vertical forests of white cedars that grow on these cliffs in Ontario called the Niagara Escarpment. So basically, the forests are vertical. No one wanted to exploit the land that was there. These trees are wizzled and twisted and gnarly. They don't have any valuable wood. And so just no one ever thought to just exploit this forest. And they started coring these trees and realized that it was the oldest and most intact old growth forest in Eastern North America. So this is an example of an old growth forest which doesn't have any of those attributes that I talked about. You should look at this book. It's full of pictures of like really beautiful cedar trees that are like 6 feet tall and like 1,000 years old. We actually have cedar like that around Lake Champlain. All right, I'm gonna so I'm on slide 23 of 39, and I have 10 minutes. So I'm gonna cruise. As we've been talking about, we live in this highly altered landscape. An important term for us to know and to recognize is the term global change. Global change is the sum total of all of the challenges, the threats and the stressors that our ecosystems are facing. It includes climate change, but it is not limited to climate change. So we get very focused on climate change and we forget that our forests are also facing altered natural disturbance regimes as a result of climate change, non-native invasive plants, animals, pests, and pathogens, a mass extinction and global constriction of biodiversity, forest loss, conversion, fragmentation, all of the effects of that historic land use, pollution, and more. And in some cases, we need to recognize that while it would be nice to believe that all of our forests, if we just left them alone, would just become old growth forests on their own, that they actually won't. Also important to recognize, folks were talking about carbon and stuff like that. One of these things that we need to balance is like managing for things like carbon, which is very in vogue right now, and then also managing for biodiversity, right? Because we also recognize that forests are these communities comprised of tens of thousands of different species, which also have the right to exist. We're in the midst of a mass extinction, massive constriction of biodiversity. There are less than 50% of the animals on the planet than there were 50 years ago. And it's just, there's 1 million animal species and plant species threatened with extinction, and there's some pretty scary facts about that. In light of all these things, not just the fact that ecosystems are dynamic inherently, but also the fact that we recognize that right now they're changing faster than ever. We need to manage forests for resilience. So we're not trying to manage them to be stable, to resist change. We're managing them to maintain their health and natural processes as they change. And we're also managing them to be adaptive. So we're trying to create forests which are able to adapt to a wide variety of potential future conditions. We don't know how all these things are going to potentially manifest in the future. So we're focused on reducing vulnerability and giving them the tools to adapt into the future. Interestingly, managing forests for adaptability and for resilience, a lot of times you're managing them for the same attributes that old growth forests have. You're managing them for structural diversity, different species or different sizes and ages of trees, different generations of trees, species diversity, different species of trees, and for all of those other qualities like deadwood on the ground, leaving some big trees in the woods, etc. And we need to recognize that the question at this moment in time, as much as we want to pull ourselves out of these forests and just let all forests become old growth, the question is not if we want to have an impact on our ecosystems. The question is, what do we want that impact to be? And resources are a part of that, where we get stuff from. It's also something that can get very complicated in the discussion about old growth forests. Is we're like, well, let's just, even if we could, let's say we could leave a forest alone, it would just become an old growth forest on its own. Where would we get stuff? Stuff comes from somewhere. Everything we're wearing, everything we use, everything we eat comes from a place. And a lot of times, the unfortunate fact is that we all could decide there should never be forest management again. And we would just get all that stuff from somewhere else where people don't have the privilege to say, not in my backyard. those resources would probably be produced under much more adverse social and environmental conditions than if they were produced here. There'd be conditions that would horrify us. So there is also something really interesting about saying, okay, we can recognize that old growth forests are really important, and we can recognize that like producing wood and other local renewable resources at home is also important, even if that doesn't necessarily allow every forest to be an old growth forest, because that allows us to protect human rights and biodiversity across the globe and to know the impacts of our consumption. I actually do a lot of this management for old growth characteristics. So recognizing, again, old growth forests, it's an interesting tool for you all as gardeners to understand, because these are sort of like the native species that we have. The characteristics of these old growth forests are the characteristics and the qualities that our native species have adapted to for thousands of years. This is just like what they're used to. And even though it may seem really weird to be managing for old growth forests and you're like cutting down a tree, I mean, what could be more bizarre than that? If we do this and we are managing forests, creating these simulation natural disturbances where we're creating gaps in the canopy and we're inciting new generations of trees, regeneration, leaving big old trees, putting dead wood on the ground, we can create these attributes which are not exactly the same as the old growth forest, but which are very similar in like a couple of decades rather than in centuries. We can also do stuff like control non-native invasive pests and pathogens, the presence of which could prevent a forest from ever becoming an old growth forest, because it would prevent the forest's natural miracle of regeneration. These are some of the attributes: structural diversity, dead wood, legacy trees. So just like people used to, in the same way that we wanted to manage our forest to be neat and tidy, people used to just cut down big trees either because they were big and mature and valuable, and who could imagine another purpose for a big tree other than to become boards, or because they were big and mature and not valuable and they were in the way of other younger, we call those big old not valuable trees decadent, and we call these younger, faster growing, more valuable trees thrifty. And we got to kill those big old trees to make way for the younger, thriftier, more valuable trees. Just don't do that. It's the easiest thing in the world. No one wants to cut those trees down anyway. Leave those legacy trees to create those incredibly rich attributes that we see in that paramortem period. You have to address threats. Deer browse, deer overpopulation, massive problem. No native predators, decreasing winter severity. The native predator really of deer is humans. And it's really, most hunters are older. So we think that from between 1970 and 2010, or I'm sorry, 1970 and 2020, we lost 50% of the hunters in Vermont, which is like losing 50% of your wolf population in the environment that we have now. Expected to lose another 50% between 2020 and 2030. And I would say, oh my God, we're so close. Two facts that I cannot wrap my head around are three facts. Number one, venison is the best meat in the world. Number two, producing beef is incredibly unsustainable. And number three, deer overpopulations are a massive biodiversity and ecology threat almost across this country. All three of those things are true at the same time. Let's just think about that for a second. Non-native invasive plants like buckthorn, honeysuckle, barberry, multiflora rose, bittersweet. If those plants are in your forest will never be an old growth forest. Not because we have some standard of purity, but because they're so good at outcompeting our native plants that every time a disturbance occurs, they will displace all your native species and they'll prevent those natural processes, that natural process of regeneration from occurring. Create complex landscapes. So what do we do? Protect all remaining old growth forests as such forever. If we still have primary forests on our landscape, which we know we do a very small percentage, obviously, do not cut them. I don't know if any of you all have read that book, The Overstory. So it's about like logging old growth redwood forests. And I work with loggers all the time. And my friend was like, I'm surprised you like that book. It's a pretty anti-logging book. And I was like, no, it's not. It's about not logging old growth forests, which we don't have to do and we shouldn't do. So that's number one. Number two, we can set aside areas as unmanaged reserves. So in the town forests that I manage them very aggressively, and about 20% to a third of all the forests that I manage are unmanaged forests, allowed to become old growth on their own, where all we're doing is monitoring, we're killing deer, and we're controlling non-native invasive plants. We're recognizing that both forest management for these attributes and forests that are unmanaged are completely complementary and compatible ideas, and we actually need both of them. Protect our remaining forests from fragmentation and loss. It can be very like sexy to be anti-logging if you love forests. In terms of impacts to forested ecosystems, logging is insignificant. We are losing permanently tens of thousands of acres of forest land a year in Vermont alone. So, and where that comes down to, and a much higher amount being fragmented, cut up into small pieces. And so a much more impactful thing than protesting against logging would be advocating for conservation, permanent conservation of forested lands and protected forest blocks, and also serving on like local planning commissions, development review boards, advocating for planning and zoning that protects ecosystems. Orders of magnitude more important. Bunch of good resources about it. And then also there's this kind of interesting list. If you search for old growth forest BPR, Brave Little State did a good program on old growth forests, and they included a partial list of where you can go see some old growth forests that you can look up. That's it. Thanks, y'all.
I want to answer about, we have 3 questions in the chat and a woman in the audience, a couple in the audience. Do you have time just to answer a few questions?
Of course.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm coming at this, my background's in plant pathology.
Yeah.
And, 30 years ago or whenever, the idea was if you had something diseased and dead and it fell, you cleared it out. So
Yeah.
it wouldn't infest anything else. Is that still like the go-to, or do you just let it go? Like
We just let it go.
do you really?
Yeah.
Even if it's invasive and it's whatever?
If it's invasive, we do not let it go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so if
So-
it's a natural sort of
Yeah.
occurring pathogen or.
Yeah, I think more what I would speak against would be people who think that if a tree dies in the forest,
Yeah.
that they have to go clean it up, which is a lot of people. And people proudly show me, where they've cleared everything out, they cut down every dead tree, and they just like created this park.
Yeah,
But yeah, no, if it's something like
ash borer or something like that.
ash borer, it doesn't matter, but there could be potentially non-native invasive pathogens where you would want to do that, because that's just sort of an unnatural influence on that system that you would need to take extra action against. But just in terms of trees dying,
Yeah.
we just leave them on the ground.
Okay.
And actually, what I tell people when I advise people about what trees they should cut, I tell them to only cut living trees. Because if a tree is dead, if a tree's on the ground, it's offering all these really cool habitats. You also, in our highly altered forests, if we're cutting living trees, we can be more proactive. So we can cut unhealthy trees that are crowding healthier trees. Whereas that dead tree, it's not doing anything to anybody, right? You're just cleaning it up just for the sake of it. Yes.
First, I'd like to second your recommendation of reading the forested landscape. I bet a lot of you like to walk in the woods. And this book is a beautiful, beautiful artwork, and it tells you how the things you notice will help you understand what that particular forest's tree is. But my question is about buckthorn.
Yeah.
My forest doesn't have any yet. However, the brook in the field below it, I have spent many hours this summer cutting out buckthorn. I had no idea how much I had, trying to protect that. However, all up and down in Boston Road and many other roads, it's thick. It's making all the, it cuts out all the light. And I noticed driving from Norwich up to Sharon, it peters out, so that there's a possibility to stop it. What is the state doing? Our town doesn't seem to be doing anything about it. What can the state help the towns, or what's happening?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like local planning and zoning, that kind of stuff tends to be town by town, which is town by town stuff can be neat sometimes. Like I really like managing these town forests, which are so much more nimble and can be more reflective of these communities because they're so locally managed. But yeah, I don't know of a town, any town, that has like a town-wide invasive control policy. And actually, like I have on my land, I dealt with a very bad non-native invasive plant problem for me. It was mostly Japanese barberry. And, and then I'm like next to the highway and just watching those, all those plants, buckthorn and honeysuckle and barberry, multiflora rose, bittersweet, just full of seed, just on the other side of the fence. And I think that at the moment that the V-Trans they can legally spray herbicide on guardrails, but not on invasive plants. So yeah, I think that there needs to be kind of a sea change in all that stuff. I have heard of a couple of towns that are trying to work on townwide invasive problems. The biggest two that I've heard towns trying to deal with are Japanese knotweed and Phragmites, because those are almost exclusively spread by road work. So those are ones that people are trying to develop policies to help town road crews like know what they are and deal with them. But I'm not aware of anything like that. Another thing we run into with non-native invasives is that they're almost impossible to kill. Like with buckthorn, cutting them, I say it just makes them mad, just makes it worse. So then, like, if you think it's hard to explain to a bunch of people who love forests that we should cut down trees and that's good for the forest, try explaining to a bunch of people that love forests that we should be using herbicide. When it's like me, who I don't want it on my food and would never think that would be ever something that would be part of something good. But it's something that we use, every conservation organization in Vermont uses on non-native invasives, not because we don't care, but because we do care. And that's how big of a deal it is. A lot of times, like you said, we'll just cut them. And I have this little tool called a buckthorn blaster. It's a bingo dauber, like for stamping a bingo card. And it's got herbicide in it. And you just stamp with a sponge tip on the surface of the stem, and you use 100th or 1,000th of an ounce of herbicide, and it kills the plant. Whereas if you didn't do that, what would happen is you would cut it, it would resprout really vigorously, you'd get frustrated and you would give up.
I'm using the stuff that
Triclopyr. Yeah.
Just dabbing it on, and it sure doesn't take very much.
Yeah, and then you can actually make progress.
Yeah.
It's empowering. I never thought that I would, I wish that like 20-year-old Ethan could see me now and how much I tell people to use dang herbicide. It's the weirdest thing. But it is, like, it's not something, if I were king of the world, using it on non-native invasive plants would be all we would use it for. It's, yeah.
What was the name?
I usually use one called glyphosate. So I don't use Roundup because it has these other surfactants that are pretty harmful, but the active ingredient, and I actually have a video on my YouTube channel that shows you where to get the tool and what concentration to use and how to do it and all that stuff. If you just search for Chittenden County Forester, cut stump application, buckthorn blaster on YouTube, it'll come up.
How many acres do you have to call it forest?
Boy, there's no rule. There's no rule to like.
So for 2 acres?
Sure. Yeah, it'd be a small forest, but I would call it forest. I mean, I almost now increasingly, the more I think about forests, I almost define them like by what they do, as much as what they are. Like if that's an area with healthy trees and deadwood on the ground and wildlife are using it as habitat, it's a forest. If that's an area where you cleaned out all the deadwood on the ground and there's like 3 planted Scots pine trees or something, not a forest. But I don't have a hard and fast definition.
Sugar biometal, and then the builder he took all my topsoil because there was a washout.
Yeah.
And he was instructed to fill the valley with topsoil. So it killed a huge sugar beet. And I watched it raw and then eventually it fell down. It has been such a education seeing what happened to that tree, which is probably 6 or 7 feet long. And it fell up slowly. All the mushrooms, all the activity, it's like totally blew my mind.
It's amazing.
And I never even expected that.
Yeah.
But it has been.
It's like these dead trees are so full of life that it almost like makes you question what it means for a tree to be alive.
I read
You know?
Humane Gardener, and it talks about 50% of the
quote, life of the tree
Yeah,
is a standing deadwood.
yeah,
So when my hemlock behind the house died, the forester, the logger wanted to take it away. And I said, no,
Yeah.
that's gonna stay there. This been, I watched the Philly woodpeckers feed on the tree.
yeah.
You know, it's just been incredible.
Yeah, it's as you watch this mortality happen, it's almost like a process of deepening, where it's like you start with all these trees that are up here, and they're all the same age, and then as mortality happens, you just develop these layers. And as you develop these different layers and different species, you attract other species. And then suddenly you go from a forest that was offering like one thing to a forest that's offering all of these different habitats to this huge range of different critters. You had a question too.
I wanted to ask about invasive snake worm.
Oh God.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everyone I know in Bedford,
It's got 'em.
everyone has them.
Yeah.
I think they all originate from garden centers when they're
Yeah.
in the mulch and the
Soil. Yeah.
And so we've had them for a really long time before they're pointed out, and they have gone off. They're in the woods. I think they're casting.
Yeah.
We have no dog layer. And do they kill the mycorrhizae?
I think they impact it. Yeah. So another mind-bending fact: we don't have any native worms,
Yeah.
and all worms are bad for forests because they actually digest leaf litter and organic material too quickly. And that leaf litter, the duff, is actually a pretty essential habitat and a seedbed. For like sugar maple, for instance, if you don't have that leaf litter layer there, they can't grow. You'll see there'll be a generation of little sugar maples, and they'll all dry out and die. And European earthworms are what we've been dealing with forever. But yeah, those crazy snake worms, the Asian worms, are really scary. I know that there are some non-scary treatments for them. So like mustard seed, you can create like a mustard seed tea, or a something with black walnut seed holes, and you can spray it on the ground, they all come up and you'll pick them out. But yeah, it's tough. We don't have a really good answer for what to do about that, except for I know that there are practices, and I don't know exactly what they are, but you all as gardeners probably do. Best practices with respect to not unknowingly transferring snake worms from location to location, because it might not be a wriggling worm. It might be these little castings that just look like a piece of soil, which we don't want to do. And when you're planting trees, bare root. Yes.
Wondering if there's any work on mycological seeding with your old growth, where you're jumping the old growth successional layers.
Yeah.
Do you have to go in and introduce mycelial networks there as much as one can, or is it they're
usually already there?
Nice.
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. It's been a weird moment for mycelium and like the wood wide web, that whole thing, because we learned that. Do you know what I mean when I say the wood wide web? And are we out of time? Do I have to stop?
Yeah,
Fine.
maybe a few more minutes.
I'm gonna take 3 minutes. And there's that book, like The Hidden Life of Trees, which is like the most widely read book about forests ever written. Turns out a lot of that stuff about trees, like sharing resources with each other, trees in the sun, giving resources to trees in the shades, facilitated by these underground mushroom networks that were expanding from root to root. Turns out we thought we knew that those things were true, and now we don't know anymore. And they might be true, but it turns out there's this thing that we do with forests where we just mythologize them all the time. We just put all this stuff onto them. It's really weird. And everybody wanted to believe that that was true. And so a bunch of scientists went back and they did a meta-analysis of all this research about mycorrhizal fungi, these fungal networks, the Wood Wide Web, and found that there was actually an institutional bias among scientists. We know that it's among the public and journalists or whatever, but like among scientists towards the idea of a Wood Wide Web. And then actually, we know that these mycorrhizal fungi are very important to trees. They're essential to how they uptake nutrients and water, but we actually don't even know how they would pass resources from one tree to another. That those connections exist, but it's not like the forest is a whole brain like we thought it was. Which is, it's very interesting to hear. Actually made a video about this. It's been so fascinating to hear the people who did that meta-analysis, some of which are the original researchers who created the research about mycorrhizal fungi, talk about it, because they're like, and this is a good takeaway, maybe a closing note about forests, that it would be beautiful if the trees were all sharing and caring with one another, if they were altruistic and entirely collaborative and non-competitive in this utopian society. But in a way, it's more beautiful for them to just be what they are, right? It's more beautiful for them for us just to know what's true about them. And the fact is that they're like lots of really interesting things about them, that whether or not they're sharing resources with each other is actually immaterial as compared to how they're creating habitat, how they're protecting biodiversity, all of these amazing things that they're doing for us all the time. I feel like we gotta stop.
Yes, we have a couple of questions in the chat, but I think we've run out of time. If people wanted to email you a couple of questions at your work address, would that be okay?
Yeah,
All
that's
right, we'll
great.
put that in the chat.
Great.
Thank you very much, Ethan.
You're very welcome.
Wow, the original forest whisperer, Ethan Tapper, thank you so much. I want to invite us all to enjoy refreshments, and also just a word of caution, because in this wonderful environment that we're in right now, if you step outside, you know, we're going to have 100% humidity and a high temperature, probably 80 degrees about now. So just be very cautious when you are going out. There are cooling stations around the Upper Valley, most libraries. Montshire is a cool place, but just be cautious as you exit and go about your day, because it's going to be a lot different out there than it is in here. Thank you so much. We'll see you next month, and please do enjoy refreshments.